Hi everybody, it's me again, and I'm entirely in my kitchen to bring you an all-new episode of Ask Sally Something. And today's question is there a God? It's a very deep question, but luckily for you, I read an article once announcing that God has officially, scientifically been proven to be real. Yay! That's good news. The bad news is that while developing formulas to support the existence of God, a group of quantum physicists inadvertently discovered that eternity cannot be observed. I'm not 100% on the significance to this, but the way they worded it made it sound really bad. So I'm going to give you all the details so you can be fully educated and share the information with your friends. Here we go. Quantum physicists began their journey to mathematically validate God by first tackling the obstacles that occur within the linear time evolutionary principle. Sounds really fancy, actually really simple. Linear time, line of time, indicates that time moves in one direction. Time can only move in one direction. No matter how many times I pull my hand back, still moving in one direction. Future will always be added. Past will always be behind the future. Now, you can imagine a regular timeline. Little tallies with little dates above it. Okay, all I want, timeline. Evolutionary. Evolution. Evolution is biological changes that occur and able to assist one's life in their own environment. So, evolution is improvement. This principle addresses the fact that evolution, just like linear time, can only move in one direction. Things can only evolve in a positive motion towards the end of improvement. Things do not devolve, evolution does not regress, evolution goes one way with linear time. Life can be wiped out completely, start again from scratch, always going one way. So basically, this principle indicates that evolution is bound to linear time. And this principle is the foundation of all biochronology today. Now, if we want to place God in time, on our imaginary timeline, God created the universe, so of course God would go in the earliest possible position we can find. And according to the linear time evolutionary principle, this qualifies God as being the lowest possible form of life or intelligence or being, or however you want to think about it. God is the lowest form of it. But this cannot be. God is the highest form. God is the ultimate of all ultimates, the sum of all sums, the biggest of all big, the greatest of all great. God should most definitely go at the very latest point we can find on the timeline. According to this principle, does this mean that God is a product of evolution? Did God evolve from something that evolved from something that evolved from something that evolved from something that is alive today? Yes, he did. This is science, not magic. So, we have God created Earth on one end of the timeline and the ultimate of all ultimates, God, on the other end of the timeline. This is two different spots. Some physicists believe that God is actually present at all times, in all places, with everyone, ever, always. And this is not impossible. This can happen if God is able to move from one place in time to another place in time to another and to all the places and times at such a speed that he appears to be in all places and times within the same moment. Great. God created the universe. God is the sum of the universe. God is in all places at all times. This all works out wonderfully unless you want eternity. Who would observe eternity? Of course, it would be God. But unfortunately, God is moving at such a speed that time has slowed to a standstill. Time has stopped. From his perspective, this might feel like forever. But in all reality, time has not passed. Following so far? Now, eternity is the infinite passage of time. God has 0 passage of time. God gets 0 infinity. Okay, theory number 2. We begin again. God is at the beginning of all time. God is at the end of all time, balancing at the edges of the timeline. This theory indicates that God is indeed at both of these places at the same time, observing all of time, looking in from either side as one entity. Also, great. Creator of the universe, sum of all things, watching us at all times. I feel the love. But the problem arises here because God is stationary at either end of time. This puts a cap on either end of time. So we are no longer looking at infinity. God is now looking at a limited amount of time, and he can look at a limited amount of time for as long as he wants to, but he will never observe infinity. Well, luckily, they came up with a third theory that eliminates the need for time travel, or being in 2 places at once, or capping time, or anything of that is simply solved by ever so slightly curving linear time. Now, this is such a minuscule curve on such an enormous scale that if you were on this timeline, it would appear to be completely flat. But if you were able to step outside of the timeline and scale it down to a teeny tiny, itty bitty little teeny little version of itself, the curve would become more defined from your perspective, and you would see that eventually time would run back into itself. Now we have a linear time loop. Yay! Does this mean that time will repeat itself over and over and over again? No, it does not. It's much like a clock. Intervals of 12 hours repeat themselves over and over again, but the same 12 hours never repeats itself. Time continues to move forward in steady forward motion. So let's go ahead and imagine our new linear time loop as a clock because it's easy for everyone to understand. Remember, we started with a straight timeline in which God was at the beginning and the end of all time. So let's pretend this is the same exact line and we're just looping it. Just curving the ends up into a circle. This places God at either side of 12 o'clock. Making sense so far? Great. So the clock strikes 12. Time moves. God creates the universe. Planets, galaxies, stars come into being, life, evolution, 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 until everything ever that ever was could be evolves into the highest form of everything ever that ever could be, and that is God, right? God's over here on this side of 12. Now, all God has to do is just continue to flow with the natural movement of time back around 12 and create the very same exact universe from which he was created. It's beautiful, fluid, solid theory. Scientists adore and accept it. All works out great, just like all the cycles they like so much. Now, this is where it gets crazy. When we introduce eternity to curved linear time, something amazing happens. Now we're going to give God the ability to observe eternity. So God will not die, fall asleep, blink, take breaks, become anything new, be reborn, just one constant, conscious, alert, ready to observe God forever. So we will do that. We will give God the ability to observe eternity. So 12 o'clock, the clock strikes 12. God creates the universe. Galaxies, planets, stars come into being. God's just watching. It's great. Having a good time. Life happens. Evolution, evolution, evolution. God's watching, hanging out. Now, at this point, everything ever that ever was and ever could be evolved into the greatest anything ever that ever could be or whatever. But God needs to observe it. So everything ever that ever was and ever could be except for God, because he's observing, will then evolve and become God. God observes it. God observes God being created. Now we have two gods. When the clock strikes 12, both of these gods create the exact same universe from which they were created. Time loops again. 2 more additional gods are made, creating another universe, creating another god, creating another universe, creating another god, and on the scale of eternity, this leads to an infinite amount of gods creating universes, creating gods, creating universes, on, and this is what we know as the multiverse. I'm sure you've heard of the multiverse as being a scenario where there's an infinite amount of possible occurrences, variables, everything that ever could possibly be, every kind of galaxy, planet, life form, everything that could ever possibly happen to you in particular, or be you, or anything you can feel or do, varies in one minuscule way or another on an infinite amount of universes. The multiverse is not an infinite amount of the same exact universe duplicated over and over and over again. The reason that is because of reproductive evolution. And I'm sure by the title, you can pretty much assume what that means. But do you know exactly how and why it works? Very simple again, as soon as it's explained to you. You remember, we began with our original linear time loop, where we began with one God who we then granted the ability to observe eternity, and he observed God being created, and then we had 2 gods who both created the same exact universe from which they were created. God number 1 came from a universe where God number 2 did not exist yet. God number 2 came from a universe which was observed by God number 1. So when they create the same exact universe from which they were created, they are not exactly the same. There is a variation in universe number 2. Now, universe number 2 pumps out its own additional God. That God creates a universe. There will be a variation, and a variation in that God, and a variation in that universe. So you see, the farther away we get from universe number 1, the more changes and variations you will see. Making sense? Here's the thing. At some point, you will get so far away from universe number 1 that you will no longer be seeing gods and multiverses. You will be seeing something that's experienced so many changes, so many variations, that it's become something different. It's a more advanced, sophisticated, evolved version of what used to be. It has evolved to its surroundings. Its surroundings are multiverses. Now, when you evolve, you adapt to utilize the materials available to you, and this most often involves the act of consumption. So, what we once imagined as this beautiful web of infinite gods and universes and multiverses and all the possibilities that could be for you now becomes an ecosystem. And in this ecosystem, universe number 1 is at the very bottom of the food chain. This all became possible because we granted God eternal life. But now, because we did this, we eliminated the probability that not only God can survive, but the survival of the timeline from which he could observe up to eternity. It's a major catch-22. You're probably wondering, well, what the hell is going on here? How do we preserve this precious timeline from which I could observe eternity? And how do we stay safe and comfy in an empty void of space where nothing exists to destroy us? This is possible. It has been proven, but this is only possible if God sacrifices himself to linear time at a point before his own creation, but after the creation of the universe. And we know that God does this because if God did not kill himself on a regular basis, we wouldn't be here today. We would have been eaten long ago by a mutant multiverse. In conclusion, yes, there is a God, and he's a lot like Jesus. You might want to think about that next time you feel like sleeping in on a Sunday morning. Well, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to write in more questions for me to answer in my next video. But until then, thank God and God bless.